Welcome everyone. How did we get here? Welcome to the first webinar of the Hack the Gates project, a collaboration between Accept and Rise. We're excited to have you all here. About 350 of you registered for the webinar, and I'm sure many of you are hopefully also live streaming, watching via Facebook. And of course, this is going to be recorded. So for anyone who was unable to make it or stay, we have this recorded. So welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Frappier.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Steve Frappier, school counselor here in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to the first of the webinars for Hack the Gates. I'm a co-founder of Accept with Marie Bigham, who is joining us from Accept World Headquarters in New Orleans, Louisiana. We also have Dr. OiYan Poon, who is director of the Rise Center, Race and Intersectional Studies for Educational Equity at Colorado State University. And as you've joined us, at the bottom of your screen, if you're new to Zoom, there's a Q&A button, and that's where I'll be helping to moderate questions that you have as we go through the various slides and questions that you have, and I'll be sure to relay those to Marie and to OiYan. I don't have I don't have my face feature today, so but please feel free to use Q&A. I'll be moderating that. If you or others are not able to join on Zoom, but you want to refer to us during this, we'll be watching for questions on Facebook as well if you go to the Hack the Gates group. And we're going to, today through our various slides with Marie and OiYan, really talking about what is Hack the Gates as an initiative and a movement. We're going to talk about the background of our project and what it is and what it isn't, the founding spirit of it. Today's topic as well is on the how did we get here, the history of admissions, and why are some of unpacking some of the current practices and perhaps mispractices, malpractice maybe on admissions. And we want to think about disruption. That's one of the main sorts of modes and lenses that we play things through in the group Accept. And we want to be able to talk about what disruption is with Q&A along the way. And we'll have other updates toward the end of our webinar time and reminders on how to get further involved with Hack the Gates and the various initiatives here. So thank you all again for joining. I'm turning it over to Marie Bigham now.
Well, first, I want to say hi to everybody and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. This is really exciting. Before we talk about Hack the Gates and give you an overview, I wanted to introduce myself and then have my partner as well, OiYan Poon, introduce herself too, so you know a little bit about who we are. So I'm Marie Bigham along with Steve. I'm one of the leaders of Accept. After over 2 decades in the world of college admissions, I recently left to work on Accept full-time as an organization and to really think about these big issues. And like Steve said, I'm here in beautiful New Orleans, and I apologize preemptively if and when my dogs start to get noisy. OiYan.
Hi everyone, OiYan Poon here, zooming in from Fort Collins, Colorado in my home office, and excited to join you all. Super excited to be working with Accept and appreciative of the support that we're receiving from Joyce Foundation for this project. And so, sorry, I just got a message that our Facebook streaming has stopped. So we'll roll with it. I will try to reconnect, but that's me. I'm an associate professor at Colorado State University and excited to be here.
Thank you so much, OiYan. So I want to start by sharing kind of an overview of this project and talk about some of our objectives and some of the components of it before we dive in. And isn't this such a great time to be thinking about admissions and to be thinking about ways that we could rethink admissions and how to approach it. So a little bit about Hack the Gates, radically reimagine admissions. So in thinking about this and writing this and like how would I describe this over and over again, the best way I can describe this is Hack the Gates, radically reimagine admissions is a project, a year-long project that really is a game that I play in my head when I can't go to sleep. And it's just that game come to life with a couple hundred friends along for the ride. When my head is spinning and out of control and I can't stop thinking and I can't sleep, the way that I go to sleep is I unknot big systems, right? Like I sit there and I think about like air traffic control or the Dallas highway system, which really makes no sense. So this whole project really comes from this idea of what would happen if we just untangled a big knot. The question that's at the core of Hack the Gates: what could a radically reimagined college admissions process look like? It's a question I really do ponder a lot when I'm asleep, or when I'm stuck in traffic, or when I'm bored at cocktail parties, or here with all of us. And like I said, this seems like really quite the right time for us to be asking this question. But how did we get to this specific project? So I was introduced to Dr. Poon in the last year as a part of the affirmative action case that's going on through Harvard, and I'm just wildly impressed with how cool and smart and funny this woman is, but also how she really gets our work. And so as we've talked about her organization Rise and about Accept, one thing that we kept talking about is how can we make sure that great researchers who are doing excellent work in the world of admissions and access and equity, how can we turn that really great research into practice? And what started out as very, very big picture conversations. And then March came. And sometime in the middle of March, there was one of the earliest days of the Operation Varsity Blues story breaking, the scandal of people bribing their children's way into college. OiYan texted me and said, do admissions people ever have the time or the place where you brainstorm different ways of doing admissions or different ways to think about it? And I really couldn't think of any space where those conversations were occurring in a thoughtful, thought-provoking way, except, at a bar, at a conference. But that was really all I could really consider. And so that started a long series of texts over a couple of weeks where we said, what might something look like if we said, here, how do we get smart people in the room to really think about this process a little bit differently? So lots of conversations and texts and Zoom calls and emails and Google Docs and everything else. So we're here. We're hosting this year-long project called Hack the Gates. And this project is going to be the catalyst for transforming that path to education and really changing this process for people. As OiYan said, I want to thank as well the Joyce Foundation, who's our generous funder, who believed in Hack the Gates before, when we were little more than just a hashtag and a witty idea. So thank you. What are some of the objectives of Hack the Gates? We want to create a community of stakeholders and change makers, people who are committed to this, and who want to think about these big, big issues and think about creative ways to solve them. We want to learn about the history of admissions and the biases that are in this system, because it's important to know how we landed in a place before we can say, how can we rethink this? Let's learn from our past. We want to generate ideas to transform this process. That's really the core of this. And then at the end of the project, we want to share research and policy papers to really start that change, to turn that great research into practice. We have a couple of components. OiYan, let's talk about those components.
Yes, definitely. So several components to the Hack the Gates year-long project. You are part of one of those. We have 4 webinars planned for this year. This is one of 4, the very first one. So welcome. It feels like the official public launch of Hack the Gates. So there's this webinar. The next one is scheduled for mid-October, and I know that we'll have the date at the very last slide at the end of this webinar. And you'll be getting registration for the second webinar, but it's really featuring several researchers, including myself, in terms, and we'll be presenting our research, analyzing how exactly enrollment management systems work. For many of you who are actually admissions professionals out there, perhaps some of the stuff we're talking about or what we'll be sharing isn't going to be a surprise, but I think, as Marie said, it's really important for us to bring together those who are practicing this work and also folks who do research analysis for a living, so that we can hopefully problematize, and that's the theme for the second webinar, is problematize these systems and to, if necessary, throw them out and start over, or come up with something just radically new outside of the box. From these, the second 2 webinars will be in the spring time, and those 2 will be featuring some of our key researchers on our Hack the Gates research team. We have 4 of them: Dr. Erin Corbett at Second Chance Educational Alliance in Connecticut, Dr. Ted Thornhill at Florida Gulf Coast University, Some of you may be familiar with his work. Last year, he did essentially an audit study on African-American activist students contacting admissions offices and different types of Black students contacting admissions offices and what offices responded or not responded. Dr. Frederick No at UNLV, whose expertise is around community colleges and access. Dr. Adrian Huerta at the USC Pulea Center for Higher Education, whose work has to do with college access and also with a focus on men of color. So we're really excited to have this team with us. You'll be learning more about them, but their primary responsibility is to work with me on several policy papers. So I hear next year, 2020, is kind of a big policy year of some sort. A couple of elections happening here and there, statewide, local, federal, national. And so it's a perfect time to really come up with really exciting ideas. And the role of the research team is to come up with very brief policy papers that explore various ideas that come out of the webinar conversations on the Facebook group, perhaps on Twitter with the Hack the Gates hashtag, and of course the hackathon. So with that, I'm going to hand this back to Marie, who will share more about the other items on this list of projects for the year.
Thank you. I just have to remember to unmute. So two other really big parts of this project are the online community building and learning, like what we're doing today, and the Hack the Gates, the hackathon, the convening, our event that we're doing in person in Washington, D.C., at meetups around the country and online. So we're going to start a little bit with a Facebook group. So as a founder of Accept, I am admittedly a big fan of Facebook groups. I think they do a great job at building community and encouraging people to kind of have interesting conversations. And so part of what we think is important with the Hack the Gates project is building that sense of community. Groups of people or folks coming in and out who care about this topic, who care about the pathway to higher education, who see the value in higher education, but also see the inequities in higher education. So we want to make sure that we have a space for folks to continue talking, not just when we have webinars, not just on the day of the convening in November, but to continue the conversations and to have them. And when you have a great idea, oh my gosh, that idea when you're sitting in traffic, that's a space for you to come say, hey, what about this? I love, and I hope he's on tonight, I love that Tony Sarda the other day posted a great idea about what would happen if there was a job exchange, what if someone shadowed, what things like that. And just that immediately bubbling up, folks were saying, hey, that could be a really interesting way of us getting to know each other differently. So we're excited about the Facebook group and utilizing social media in that way. And then we have the hackathon. So the hackathon is really the core of the project and kind of how we started down this path. What would happen if we did something like this? And it was really incredibly cool to talk with OiYan and to realize that we were both coming up with exciting different ideas. So the hackathon itself is 2 evenings, or rather 2 days, November 8th and 9th. There will be an in-person meeting that's in Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, because of the nature of this type of event and space and all of those things, this is going to be limited to about 100 people. And thanks to everyone who gave us great nominations and great ideas. And we're going to reach out to everyone in the next week with more information. But as we were planning this, it was important for us to develop other ways for people to engage in this topic if they couldn't be in a space. And it's funny because even though we keep using language like selective admissions, like thanks for your nomination and we'll get back to you, and people asking is there a deposit, stuff like that, we don't want to necessarily use that model, but space is limited, and how do we then expand that? So we're going to continue to use the Facebook group, and on the day of the event, hopefully utilize the Facebook group in that way for people to participate in real time. We'll utilize Zoom, this tool, and hopefully, we're working hard on this, we're going to have meetups either the day of or the days surrounding, so that if you can't be there but you still want to chat with people in person, that if there are folks who are interested, we can help you get together and use kind of the curriculum. We're very, very excited that the event that's occurring in November is going to be a little bit different. We'll talk in further detail, especially as it comes together. But as OiYan and I and Steve and Brandy and others really talked about this program, one of the things that we said was, if we knew as professionals, as practitioners, as researchers, how to fix this, we probably would have already. And just that acknowledgement that maybe we don't know best all the time. And one of the things that I tried to do this year is to start going to other conferences and professional development events that were different. And one that I went to that was hugely influential for me was the South by Southwest Education Conference. And then this year I also participated in the Facebook Community Summit. And both of those were events that were not that typical conference. And so Hackgates, the hackathon especially, is not going to be the typical. There's not going to be panelists. There's not going to be, one big room and name badges where everyone talks about your institution. We've engaged with an outstanding organization called the Creative Reaction Lab, which is a design thinking organization that will help plan the event and plan the engagement, but they come at it from an equity-centered lens, and they're from St. Louis, Missouri. So we're excited to work with them. And we're going to be reaching out, like I said, with more information about the hackathon and how you can participate otherwise in the next week or so. And that's a very quick overview.
I'm sure we'll have, well, unfortunately, I won't be there, but I'm sure there'll be lots of conversation next week at NACHAC. I'm really sorry I won't be able to join you all in Kentucky, but things come up. So I'm excited for the conversations that will happen there. Steve has told us there's a question from the crowd. How will accept and Hack the Gates stay independent yet focus all of our efforts? Marie, do you have thoughts on that question?
Sure, thank you. I think that's a really interesting question, because one of the things as OiYan and I were planning this and talking with different folks, just as a little bit of background, one thing that we were pushed to do, people couldn't quite wrap their head around the idea of we're going to have this giant brainstorming session without a lot prescriptive going into it. And they would say things like, oh, so maybe you want to talk about being test optional. Like, no, we don't want to go into this with anything prescriptive. And yet, both our organizations, the RISE Center and Accept, our focus is about race and inclusion. Our focus is on equity. And with Accept, our focus is on anti-racism. So on one hand, I don't want to say, hey, we're going to walk into Hack the Gates assuming that that will also be everyone's focus, that equity and specifically anti-racism is going to be the stakeholders' specific goal. So I think that's one way that Hack the Gates is slightly different than Accept. Now, at the same time, I know it's important to us as an organization, and I assume it's probably important to OiYan too, that she can certainly speak for herself, that talking about race and talking about equity is an absolutely critical part of this. And if we're going to strip this thing down and rebuild it, at least for me, that's got to be at the dead center. Hope that kind of answers the question. But OiYan, you want to jump in?
I'm a professor, so I answer questions with questions sometimes. So my question was independent from what? So I'm wondering, the question again was, how will Accept and Hack the Gates stay independent yet focus all of our efforts? And so I'm very curious. Even though a long time ago I was an admissions reader, I was certainly not embedded in your field. And so I'm still learning every day as I work with Marie and Steve and Brandy, more and more about what these various terms are and concepts are. And so that's my question. My response is another question. Let's see. So another question is, are you planning to include student voice, college or high school students in the hackathon? Marie, I think you'd be really good to answer that.
Oh gosh, Tara, really, student voice, user voice is the way that I've been really thinking of it, has been absolutely at the core of thinking about this since the beginning. When we said, let's have this. It wasn't, I think one of the things that makes us different in thinking about this is that it's not just researchers and practitioners, or practitioners and leaders of their institutions, but rather who really sits all around that table. And users, in this situation, the user is a really critical voice in this process and in this path that's virtually ignored so often, unless it's like a marketing survey or something. And one of the things I've really learned in the last couple of years as a student, or working with students in a high school, is that they don't necessarily believe that who they are, or what stories they want to tell, come through in this process. But I think even more critically, they're not really sure why, how, and what they're being asked is relevant to what we think the process is about. And so having students engage, having applicants engaged, and that might be someone who is, 16 years old, who is just now thinking about it, or someone who is in their second year of college and a little bit away from it, or a returned veteran who's just now exploring using their GI Bill. There's so many different users now that I think that has to be a part of it. But thank you for that.
Yeah, and to clarify, it seems like Priscilla's question was about the overlap of accept and hack the gates. What the relationship is between hack the gates and accept. So Marie.
Sure. I think that it's except we're in the room as the practitioners, Rise are the researchers in this. I think that's the voice that we bring to this conversation. And that we do have a specific focus and a specific lens that we look at this world through. But Rise are the research group, and they're the ones who, it's always so funny talking with OiYan about this. They take what I love to call the anecdata of the stories of admissions and pull that back and say, well, here are the stories that are coming from the data and from the numbers. So I think that's how that really kind of fits together that way. This is our first collaborative effort that we've had within Accept, and we were really careful about that. We wanted to collaborate with an organization that was mission aligned with us, that was fun and creative and smart. So I'm excited about this opportunity.
And if I can give kind of my part of that answer from the researcher end of thing, from the RISE Research Center side of things, and my work, the mission of RISE is to bring together research scientists with practitioners in education. So RISE is a relatively new research center, and so this, the Hack the Gates project is also our kind of first, go at doing this research practitioner partnership work. And, I think I take a lot of my work, and if there's any of my students, former students out there watching, they'll know this. A lot of my work I think about through a Freirean lens, Paulo Freire. So using critical analysis to then inform action to change the world. And so because I don't work in the world of admissions, it's really critical to partner and collaborate and be in conversation equally with practitioners, so that my research is not, as my colleague Dr. Susana Munoz says, that we're not doing harm as researchers because we're not familiar on a day-to-day basis with what the lives of practitioners are and what the work is on a day-to-day basis. And, sure, we can examine it, we can interview people, we can talk to people all we want, but at the end of the day, we're not working in the system as so many of you are. And so we need to have those conversations so the analysis can be informed and done in partnership with people who are doing the work in the system, so that together we can change the system, is kind of from the researcher angle how I would, the flip side of the coin of what Marie just shared.
Well, and to add along to that, it's important we have the practitioners, it's important we have the researchers, but to go to the previous question about the users being there, that's equally important too. And it's something else. And one of the things, again, I'm excited that we're engaged with Creative Reaction Lab to help us really design the perfect guest list to, oh God, I'm going to say it again, mold the class. What I love about working with them is they're really great at being able to say, okay, well, here are other voices that should be there. There is a whole wide group of people who are perfectly capable, have the tools and the means to go on to higher ed and choose not to. For them, how does this process speak to them or keep them out? And so it's really important to us to recognize, I think, that as practitioners, we don't have all the answers. As researchers, we don't. And even together, we're a bunch of really smart people who are often very well dressed, but yet that doesn't mean that we know the answers to any of this. And I think because we should, we should open those doors. Yeah.
Okay. Marie, this is you again.
Okay. So I love this picture. I love this picture so much. If we look at this picture, so here's this house we think it's a house, it's a structure that's on the beach. that doesn't really seem to have anything underneath it, that's leaning to a side. Some of the walls seem to be working. Why is this on a beach? So when we look at this picture, let's think about the college admissions process as kind of this structure. And if we were to fix this specific structure, like what would we repair first, right? Would it be that the foundation of it? Would it be the lack of safety features on it? Would it be the location of it? The walls seem fine. Is it just too far gone? Do you do it from one specific location and move on? Should it even have been there in the first place? I think kind of the founding spirit of this project is summed up in that way of how you look at that picture. So here it is, it's this benign picture, but what are we gonna do with this that's sitting on this beach here? I'm gonna quote one of my favorite philosophers, John Bockenstedt, who presciently wrote in 2015 in a piece he recently reposted. John said, "I'd like to propose that admissions will only survive in anything close to its current state if we experience something called punctuated equilibrium, or PE for short." Punctuated equilibrium is a theory that evolutionary studies that suggest successful evolution happens very rapidly over relatively short periods of time, and then it goes dormant for a long, long time. That's where we are. And our choices regarding college admissions, John says, are pretty clear. We can do it ourselves, or we can have someone do it for us. The question is whether we take the reins and move forward fearlessly, understanding the greatest risk is to do nothing or to sit back in fear, hoping to survive. I vote for the former, and I think it'll be fun. Yeah, so that was just 4 years ago, and I don't know. And if John, if you're out there and you knew about Varsity Blues coming, or you knew about POJ, or you knew about all these things happening, or the financial aid scandals, that'd be really great if you could have told us beforehand. But if not, what an interesting piece. And certainly, Operation Varsity Blues shone that big, gigantic light on what we know as practitioners to be abuses of a system that, you know, they crossed the line, but barely. Those things weren't surprising. You can look at NCAA and say, well, gosh, things are crazy there. What's going to happen there? But I don't know if any of us could have predicted the Department of Justice kind of happening at this moment as well. What having a challenge structure would be like if we suddenly didn't have our guardrails or our safety features. If the house is burning down, if the house was built on a crappy foundation to begin with, and if someone took out all of the smoke detectors, what would you do? So it's kind of the dark way of looking at this, but I think really the most important part of John's piece is to say, I think it will be fun. This is going to be fun. We're going to enjoy this. I'm going to put into the chat box the link to his piece. Another thing I just wanted to share in terms of kind of the founding spirit of Accept in this picture, or I'm sorry, not Accept, but of Hack the Gates, to give you a little insight into to why this is what this is and what we're doing, is to really think about this title of it, Hack the Gates, Radically Reimagine Admissions, because I think OiYan and I were really careful and intentional as we thought about how we wanted to describe ourselves. So to go through it, the first word, hack. Hackathons require a lot of minds and perspectives. It requires a fearlessness, requires tossing out sacred cows, and requires that people treat all voices equally. Gates. What are these? Why the gates? I think gates are that often used metaphor that we see so much in admissions, and it might be on an opening page of a website, or if you still have viewbooks, the vision of those majestic gates with the name of the university overlooking the quad, right? This is your welcome. Or it's that gate that separates the great unwashed from that beautiful lush green quad. Or it might be the title of the seminal book of college admissions, The Gatekeepers, but we use gates a lot in this. The process of college admissions is a gate that welcomes you in, or it's a gate that keeps you out. And for practitioners, we open the gate or we close it. It's also important to remember for all of us who work in this process, we all support this. Why radically? Those of you who know me personally know that I love talking about maybe doing things in a radical way, but why would we do this radically? I think it's because we have to acknowledge that we can't transform an entrenched system by using frameworks that were tried and true and tested, or by waiting for permission from anyone. We just have to do things right now. What do we mean by reimagine? Why not just design? Why not think of it that way. But we said reimagine really specifically because we need to acknowledge first and foremost that the current system that we have was designed and it was imagined by someone or someone's, and it's kind of kludged together, but it didn't just pop out of Zeus's forehead like a zit. It is just, it's a system that someone had to think of. And so I think we have that agency, and we're going to take the reins to say, we're going to redesign this. We're going to reimagine this. We're going to imagine this. But this time we're going to do it with vision and intention and creativity. And from our perspective, with an eye towards equity. And then admissions. We got to focus our work someplace, right? So we're focusing this work on the process and the path to post-secondary education in the United States. We know that college admissions has a huge and wide range and reach in all aspects of education, but we can't fix all of it. So we're taking responsibility for our part in all of this. That's kind of the driving spirit of this.
Yeah,
Well,
I love it. Yes, I love it. Of course, your questions are like, why do we open it? Why do we close the gates? My question, especially after Varsity Blues, was why don't we just throw it all away? Like, why do we have a gate to begin with? Was my question. And maybe it's not the most practical question, but I am of the school of thought that if you don't imagine it, if you don't radically envision something new, nothing new will ever come. And so I want to return to the questions. Someone's asked, you've talked about the roles of researchers, practitioners, and students in reimagining college admissions. How do you envision the role of journalists in helping to make your efforts more accessible to a broader audience? What stories should we be telling that haven't yet been told? And if I could take a first crack at this, Marie, because I know we just talked about this earlier today, actually, so that's fun. But this question, one of my biggest pet peeves is that oftentimes very few people actually understand how admissions works in a selective way, how holistic admissions works. And I see myths and misconceptions being perpetuated by the most well-intentioned, well-researched journalists out there. And it drives me nuts, with the exception of perhaps last week's somewhat ground-shaking essay by Paul Tough, part of his new book. I think very few journalists get it right. And I think for me, because my research trajectory has come from the racial politics of affirmative action and Asian Americans in particular, one of the things that plagues the public debate, that plagues the public from having a sensible, evidence-based conversation about college access, is the lack of good information that and evidence-based stories that are being put out there. So I'll just stop there and hand it over to Marie to add her part.
Well, along those lines, and you're describing something that came to my mind, and that was the story that broke in the winter about TM Landry School here in Louisiana. And this story, you know, splashed all over the front page of the New York Times, was an important one, but I think that the journalists got the most important part of the story wrong. So, you know, here's a school that falsified documents, that did all these terrible things to kids, and that's really important. But there was this also a sense to the story of, and some of it was spoken, some of it was unspoken, of here poor Black kids from rural Louisiana thinking that they could go to Harvard and Stanford and Princeton and Yale and LSU and Temple and Dillard and just on their own, and they had to cheat, and we know that they're not doing well. Some of them came home. And I think what we really missed in that story, and where good journalists like you can be really helpful in this, is by telling the most interesting part of the story to me, which was here were students who arguably were taught test prep all day, who had falsified grades and kind of fraudulently, you know, test scores, whatever, that were still lower than what those colleges admitted. And the majority of the students stayed and graduated. They did just fine. And so to me, the interesting part of the story is, why are all those things that are considered sacred cows, the things that are considered meritocracy, things that are considered predictive, why didn't that work here? And where else isn't that working? And maybe those colleges that are so predictive just aren't all that different, or selective aren't all that different than the ones that aren't. And so I think that we definitely want to keep great journalists and folks who want to get this story right in here. And you know, one thing I know that is that journalists who cover this story see a lot more in a broader scope than we do as practitioners. And so please keep engaging, and we're going to keep engaging with you.
Yes. So any other questions? I'm going to see if there's any other questions in this moment before I move on to our next slide. Our next slide is essentially my history lecture. So, okay. So, I attended a Jesuit university for undergraduate and was required to take a global history, specifically I should say, Western history course as a first-year student. And I will always remember Father Murphy saying, you know, we got to remember all these lessons, right? History is prologue for present and future. Nothing really new, but as a first-generation college student, that was pretty interesting to me. So it really stayed with me. In any case, to understand and analyze our college admission systems, we need to first look at the history, right? So I'm going to blow through, what is this, like 400 years of history right now, as quickly as I can. So 1642, as we all know, that's the start of U.S. higher education. It's the founding year of Harvard. And between 1642 to 1800, higher ed scholars commonly refer to this as generally the colonial era of U.S. higher education. The purpose of enrollment at that time was, you know, the curriculum was a classical one, classical education, quote unquote, and it was for training ministry and national leadership in this new settler colonial nation state. Those who were let in were, you know, their qualifications were white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, wealthy, cisgender male, presumably straight, wealthy, did I say wealthy already? And then one of the very few requirements for admission was proficiency in Latin and Greek. So then moving on to the early 1800s, historians call this the rise of private academies. So this is the era when you start having places like the University of Chicago being founded. And interestingly, these in the early 1800s, these private academies were focusing more on quote unquote practical curriculum. And their admission requirements included a broader range of secondary school coursework. And students applied to these institutions if they were affiliated with their faith. So this is when you have a lot of faith-based private institutions being opened, and so admission was basically based on your membership within that faith-based community. And there were increasing and varied admission requirements that I know there's a lot of folks in high schools or counsel high school students and families and those on the college side. As you can imagine, on the high school side, folks were getting really frustrated. Those who had the privilege to even consider having their students go on to higher education, much less even have a K-12 system to attend, they were getting frustrated with the range of requirements. There was really no standardization of requirements in this period. And so at around that time, you start having this movement, early conversations about the need for a more uniform national system of college admissions. Also in this time period, you start having the founding of women's colleges that were established mostly as teaching seminaries, preparing women for, you know, what we kind of disparagingly say the MRS, right? Preparing them to be proper wives and mothers to these white wealthy men. And so we move on to the settler colonial expansion period from 1860 to 1890. This is when the Civil War is going on, is finishing up, and you have the Morrill Land Grant Acts 1 and 2. The second one establishing, the first one establishing, let's go chronologically, the first Land Grant Act, Morrill Act, establishing land grant universities like my own, Colorado State University, is a land grant university. And I call this the settler colonial expansion because, as we know, in this history, this is part of the westward expansion manifest destiny, seizing land, dispossessing indigenous peoples and communities of their land. And the second Moral Land Grant Act established historically Black colleges and universities. Generally, admissions was open admissions as long as they met minimal, very minimal qualifications for college readiness. It was based on courses completed and sometimes a written or an oral examination. And in the curriculum, it was very much scientifically based, agriculture, mechanics. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution at this time. So this was very much about addressing public needs. But because education was still not fully universal yet, we're talking about a lot of remediation for students when they arrived on college campuses. So moving on to the next era, and some would call this the standardization era of 1890 to about 1920. I call it the eugenics standardization era. This is also around the time when eugenics science, racist science was very, very popular in this time. It not only informed our educational policy, but it also informed a lot of our immigration policy. And in this era, as I said earlier, about 100 years prior to this, folks started talking about the need for standardization. Well, this is when it starts taking hold, the standardization movement. High school diplomas became required for college entrance. The College Entrance Examination Board was first established, and all of this testing, the rise of testing, was very much connected to this notion of intelligence testing, which coincided again with the racist eugenics movement. So moving on to the 1920s to the 1940s, we have what I'm calling an era of stratification, discrimination, and a research mission, fully taking hold in US higher education. You start having this bifurcation of universities where some are the more established, older private institutions are becoming extremely much more selective. But then on the other side, because of settler colonial expansion, you start having more open access institutions on both sides of the spectrum. Students had these options. But again, you still have this movement of eugenics, creating a foundation for standard measures of admission. You have anti-Semitism taking hold, xenophobia. All of this is within our society was shaping admission. And with specifically, as Jerome Karabel has talked about in his book, The Chosen, IB institutions are the big three, creating quotas, anti-Semitic quotas under the guise of admission of students with, quote, proper character. And in this era, you also have the start of recruitment efforts kicking off. So that tradition of work in the field around recruitment started around the Great Depression, because as you can imagine, with a downturn in the economy, all these institutions still have their budgets to make. So some things never really change, right? And so people started traveling the country, recruiting, and to make their targets at their institutions. We move into the 40s to 1965. You have an era of massification. You have the GI Bill that created a very high demand and public funding for increased college enrollment. You have, to meet that demand, you have a growth of national public institutions, universities, comprehensive and regional public universities, community colleges come into play, and increasingly some more private, nonprofit, and for-profit institutions. And this is when, in this era, private universities, long-established ones, started actually practicing early forms of early decision and early action to manage their enrollments. Testing was not fully unified yet. There were still some institutions that were taking regional and National Association sponsored college entrance exams. But slowly but surely, we're moving towards a universal test, one or two, right? And then we move on to what I call an era of diversification and backlash. And So 1965, right? This is at the height of the civil rights movement, and moving into the 1990s, you have this long era of really white backlash to the civil rights movement. You have a lot of immigration reform at this time as well that led to the civil rights movement, immigration movement. You have education policy reform. It led to an increased access to higher education for a lot of new emergent populations and populations who had not had access or not given access prior to this time period. You have the Higher Ed Act of 1972 that established the Pell Grants. Federal financial aid began following individual students. You have higher ed opportunity programs and TRIO programs that are established. This is around 1972 is when Title IX was passed. But then, of course, also in the 70s, you had the Bakke case versus University of California in 1978, which began the rollback of affirmative action in college admissions. But it's also in the 70s is when analytics and marketing really started taking off. And as a field in profession, enrollment management was really beginning to be established. And as Beale in his 1970 article on the history of admissions talks about, he said, this is the era when the growth of holistic review really started taking a new form, where students were being reviewed for, quote, character, emotional stability, and leadership qualities. And now moving into 1990s to 2016, 2016, of course, being when Fisher II was decided, we have competition, increased competition, solidification of holistic review, and continued white backlash. This is when, by the 1990s, you've got the US News and World Report rankings increasing in institutional importance. The Common App becomes more common to, I'm so punny, common, which then increases application numbers and competition among applicants. You've got Proposition 209 in California and other state bans, ballot measures banning affirmative action. And within this context, and perhaps in some ways due to some of these affirmative action bans, you've got a solidification really coming, a holistic review or comprehensive review really coming into the fold and solidifying as a process to review individual applications, perhaps in response to Bakke as well as Grutter and Gratz in 2003, and then later the Fisher cases in 2013 and 2016. And holistic review coming into maturity to review each applicant as an individual. And then, of course, you've got various other new developments, such as the coalition application, test optional movements in this era. I think a lot of these things, for better or worse, may have been intended to be a long overdue start, some efforts here and there to change the system. But we really do need a much more comprehensive movement. Hopefully what you're taking away from this overview of 400 years of history is things changed. Things have always been changing. Things have not really stayed the same over time. And what I really took away from just analyzing, and you can see the references for this very brief presentation on the bottom of this slide. What I really take away are two things. One is things have been changing. We often hear in higher education people saying, well, you know, when I was a young professional, I would ask, why do we do this the way we do? And the answer I would often get back would be, well, it's how we've always done it. But when you study history, you realize it's not always how we've done things. So then that shouldn't stop us from thinking of new ideas and perhaps doing things differently. So what's next? And I have this question here, what's next? How will we lead to shape what's next? If there's another takeaway that you can really get from this is that I was reminded in doing research for this is that in the 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s, that it was eugenics that informed the establishment of the way we have done admissions perhaps for the last 100 years or so. And from social status and qualifiers to eugenics-based standardization to limited open access, we're continuing to reckon with the legacies of a movement for standardization in admissions from a century ago. And so the Hack the Gates project begins with the premise that we cannot simply tweak what we have, because what we have is fundamentally flawed and was created about 100 years ago based on eugenics to reproduce inequalities and injustice and race, class, and gender in college admissions. So when we look at history, we learn the key lesson is we need a new movement for equity and admissions. So that's all I got to say for now, and I'll just turn it back to.
That's all. I want to share this question that
that's all.
just in a nutshell. It's just a quick question that John Burdick posted that I think it's a really interesting one. Characterization of some of these areas is how higher ed evolved as both a private and public good. We're in an era of maximum private benefit interpretations. John, I think that's such a valid point, and it's something that I don't know. I feel like the conversations about admissions would be really different if perhaps we acknowledge that. If institutions quit saying about public good and this is about maximizing dollars, but then what does that change about nonprofit status and on and on and on. But I'm curious, OiYan, what are your thoughts, reactions?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that is certainly a central argument in higher education today. I think even, I would say the marker was 1972 when, was perhaps like the start, if some would argue maybe even earlier, during World War II when higher ed's mission started moving towards, one of its missions was about research and really around the war machine, globalizing effects, a colonial kind of mission, research for a nuclear bomb, for example, the nuclear age. You could argue, is that public good? It is certainly, the weapons industry has certainly become a private interest. I mean, so this has always been a very important question throughout the history of higher education. We are certainly in an era that is very much about private interest. The consumerism that we find among students, it's not been uncommon for me to hear from students or their parents, well, I pay for your salary. Thankfully not in my current program. Thank you, students. But I mean, this is a thing, right? What exactly, I mean, at the heart of maybe even the Hack the Gates project, would you say, Marie, is this question of what is this all for?
Yeah.
Right? Big philosophical questions, I think.
Who does this serve? What is the purpose?
Mm-hmm.
I was listening in prep for this and some other things. I was listening to an interview with Eric Hoover as opposed to Eric Hoover interviewing someone, and it was on Davin Sweeney's podcast, The Crush, where one of the things that Eric said was this very question, like, what's the purpose of higher ed and institutions, and how does admissions feed that or not? And he said there almost no one in leadership positions will acknowledge admissions is to serve the institution first and foremost, and the institutional goals. Like, we always start with and center, at least in our language, it's about students, it's about the students, it's about the students, but is it? And that to me seems like a central question to Hack the Gates is who exactly are we serving? Is that multiple people? Does that depend on where you sit? How does that fit? And depending on the power position you're in, what's the real answer to that? But
it's complicated.
It's complicated. We'll go to this question from Ralph Figueroa. And I love Ralph for these questions. And it reminds me of your dear friend. So Ralph's question, it says, this means the standardization itself becomes the problem. Is there a single solution? Love the question. And it also reminds me of the other admissions philosopher king from Chicago, Ted O'Neill, who fought so hard against the common application for so long, for his institution using it, saying that we're not common. And then they joined. And what does that mean in any number of things? So, Dr. Poon, standardization itself the problem?
I don't know. I
And
don't
for whom
know if,
is it the problem?
what's that?
And for whom is it a problem?
Yeah, I don't know if standardization is the problem, but I do know that the root and foundation of the standardization that we do have today, it has a very ugly history. So what does that mean then? What are the implications then going forward? Do we just make some renovations to that collapsing structure, or do we really question and say, like, maybe we shouldn't build on sand, as someone had said earlier when we were looking at that picture of a dilapidated structure on a beach by an ocean, right?
Right.
So
Those walls look healthy, but maybe they're filled with, just termite carcass and hope, like my walls here in New Orleans, I'm pretty sure are. I like this question, also another interesting one. And I love this question because it's showing and just demonstrating how people do want to think about really big things with this, which is exactly what we hope to do. Going forward, what role do you see for AI and for big data in admissions?
What I will say is that some of you all know that I'm currently completing a data collection right now, interviews of admissions professionals on the college side at selective institutions funded by the Spencer Foundation. My goal is 50. I'm at 48. There are 2 more of you who want to volunteer for an interview, just 2 more. That's a side note. But what I'm finding really fascinating with these interviews is almost everyone is talking about big data. There's a very large role in big data. And what seems to be really interesting to me, and more on this study in the webinar too, what's been fascinating to me is that the reading season is all about recruiting, and reading season is all about recognizing each individual student's human dignity, right? It's a highly qualitative process, if I may. And then you get to a stage that we know as shaping the class. And many people are talking about the big data, the analytics, in predictive modeling. And that doesn't feel as humanizing as that reading stage. But that said, what I'll share about the potential for public good of big data, I think that's the other part of the question or comment, is my interest is, I'm very interested often in what some I've interviewed have talked about, which is asking the question when they're reading the applications, will this student thrive here? Key parts of that question being this student and here, and thrive being the connector between the two. So I have started wondering recently whether or not data can be used in some good way to do that. So what some people have called fit, matching, whatever. But finding that matchmaking through big data, I don't know. Marie?
I always think about something when it comes to conversations about big data and admissions is that we're still talking about, actually I take that back. We are in many ways talking about teenagers. Not always, not in aggregate, so let me qualify that. But in many ways, we're talking about teenagers when it comes to the decision-making process of admissions. So if enrollment management wants to use big data to help make predictive choices about the behavior of a 17-year-old, it's like they've never met 17-year-olds. If you want to find the least predictable creature on earth, it's going to be a 17-year-old. And so, yeah, you might get a number of what 10,000 of them might do. You might get other things, but at the end of the day, it's still that 17-year-old. And I think that's one of the truisms, and something I both love and hate about college admissions is that we're all judged on the irrational decision making of 18-year-olds.
I mean, I keep asking questions in my interviews. I have follow-up questions upon follow-up questions, and a couple of times I've been like, so your job, if I was to summarize, was to try to be a crystal ball.
Yep.
For young people who are really unpredictable. I mean, just think back to our own high school days, right? I'm like, the number of times my parents said to me, "What were you thinking?"
Right. But let's think about the things that we know are predictable, because I think as you and I are talking about this, and it's just acknowledging that we are speaking from a really specific lens of selective admissions with this idea of what is a traditional student, that teenager, right? And we need to acknowledge as we hack the gates that that's not who is necessarily attending college right now, or why. And so as we're talking about big data, perhaps big data and predictive models are better suited for the population actually attending college now. And that's someone who is in their mid-20s and a little bit later. You know, perhaps that work does become better when we get away from the squishy minds of teenagers and more, and to put it this way too, and the emotional reactions of parents, and we move more towards adults who are making financial decisions. Perhaps that predictive work as change becomes more valid. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. And I love the way you highlighted that point, Marie, about, you know, who are we thinking about when we're thinking about college students? Admittedly, Hack the Gates started with this question around more selective admissions, but we do need to think also about college access for who we are as a country, who we are as a public, right? When we're thinking about who we're serving. And, you know, one of our research team members, Dr. Erin Corbett, works with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated populations. There's lots of gates for those folks who are trying to make them, you know, do something good and move on and grow and have a second chance at education. And so when we're thinking about hacking the gates, we should be thinking about these various populations, just a range and diversity of populations. And that's why I was intentional to also reach out to, you know, community college experts as well. Yeah.
And this fits with this question as well. Will the stakeholders of the project include folks outside of admissions, college CFOs in particular? Absolutely. I love my people. It's a profession. Some of my best friends are admissions professionals. Hate that. But the truth is, as I said earlier, if we knew how to fix this, we would have. If we were empowered to fix it, we would have. If we had the agency to fix this, we would have. And so we need other people in the room. And so, yeah, we're going to have practitioners. We're going to have research folks. We're going to have users. We're going to have policymakers. We do, as your question, you know, college CFOs, we do have several folks who are in the highest levels of university administration who are committed to participating in the project with us. We have people who are lawmakers and high-level decision makers and policymakers who are engaged in this as well. So hopefully they'll be here on webinars. Hopefully they'll be at the convening in one way or another with us, but know that we're trying to engage with all these different folks in as many ways as we can. Next question, and then I think we move on to our next little topic. What role do we see online education in playing in this project? I'm not sure. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's I went to it because it's telling me that's something that we haven't thought about yet. So it's time to make a note on the desk.
The irony is, of course, that I teach in an online hybrid graduate program. But I mean, that's something definitely to think about, is how is online education, right? I think earlier, about 5-7 years ago, I think MOOCs were all the rage, and I think in many ways they were undermining public interests, and really it was certainly a disruptor, but you know, there were a lot of questions about for serving who, in what ways, how, right? Who was harmed in that? Is the refashioning of higher education through online education, are there consequences that maybe we don't want? So I think that's something to keep thinking about.
Yeah, thank you for. I don't know why y'all have seen this, but if you have not been in my house and seen my home office or heard me ramble about it, I have a motorized stand-up desk, and the whole giant surface is a whiteboard where I write my most important notes, and I just wrote that note, so thank you. It went on the desk whiteboard, so it's real. I absolutely love this question. I think it's a really critical one. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the ways that we can prevent the silos that exist for K-12 education and higher ed in how we talk about college admissions. It seems that a part of the equity gap is an unintended consequence of K-12 assuming that we all get it and higher ed thinking that they get it and not finding enough common ground amongst us.
That was Brandy's question. Hey, Brandy.
What do you think?
I feel like I've been in conversations where Brandy or somebody else was talking about the idea of doing kind of fellowships where people on all sides of that desk, you know, spend a few days in each other's shoes, just to live that experience and see firsthand what these inequities are really, where these inequities are really coming from. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I think about some just little moments I've experienced in the time that I've left since leaving working in a school to work on Accept. So one of the things I'm doing right now is looking at fellowships and startup funding and all those cool things. And what I'm finding is that people don't know where to put college admissions and college counseling on that spectrum, that timeline, that rigid timeline that we have that says pre-K through 16. And so I've talked with some folks who have said, we love this project, we want to support Accept, we want to support Hack, but we do K-12 education. And then I have to spend a lot more time explaining how K-12 education is deeply impacted by this. And then, oh, light bulbs. The same in talking with foundations and funders who are focused on higher ed. Well, how would this fit? You know, because you're talking about more school counselors. And so there is a really lack of understanding of how the work and the impact of college admissions is kind of this weird spider web that kind of lays on top of education in general. In terms of those silos, I do think that I hope one of the side benefits of this project and more to come is bridging that gap and having a different understanding of what it is to be a researcher in this space versus what it is to be a practitioner in this space, and the different perspectives we bring and the validity of those perspectives. And I think just in planning this, OiYan and I have had several of those moments where I've walked away like, oh, damn, I didn't understand how she or her folks understood this differently. And it's built my level of respect so much, but I think at least for me, taking down some of those barriers and misunderstandings personally. But
yeah, we got a lot of questions here, y'all. Woohoo. Mary Newell, comment ask, I work in a graduate health science institution and data is the only way we can get things done. Our biggest question per admissions is, how can we change where we can bring in more diverse classes? Would this be an area the project would be willing to also help change? So as somebody who runs the admissions process for my graduate program, what I will say is one of the things that really bugs me is this false dichotomy between diversity and quality.
Amen.
Right, and I think that we need to remember that, you know, so I had the opportunity to really lead our admissions process here in my graduate program, and we start with our mission. Our mission for our program is around diversity and equity. It's a PhD program for in higher education leadership. If anyone is interested, we're having a prospective student webinar. Reach out to me. But you know, starting with that mission should then, because that's our mission, right? It should then drive our recruitment, which it has. It should then drive how we evaluate our students. I think that unlike many graduate programs, I think we have a pretty rigorous, I've had prospective students tell me that it's a pretty rigorous process. And in the end, I am very satisfied with the cohorts that we end up enrolling. These students have pushed me in a really great way. Students have helped me think at a next level. And they're probably the most highly diverse cohorts of students I've ever had the privilege of working with. And so I think that, you know, there are ways to play with the edges that we already have to bring in more diverse classes, but it's a real, you know, I think you need to start with asking the questions of, you know, foundational values of the programs that you're admitting for and what you're doing the enrollment management for. That's just a thought, but I know a fantastic book, Julie Posselt's book, Inside Grad Admissions, is really great. A former student of mine, Dr. Deanne Squire at Northern Arizona University, has also done work on graduate programs and diversity. So I'll just leave it there. Marie?
You know, I'm gonna actually suggest we do something slightly different, OiYan, if that's okay, than
Please.
our plan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's my thought. We have so many outstanding questions going that I don't think any of the stuff that I wanted to talk about is all that interesting in comparison. And so I'm going to take a quick look at my script and see, but I think that you and I can skip right past some of these other things. There are just a couple of really quick things I wanted to mention, just as we talk about what is Hack the Gates and what is it, what isn't it. Just wanted to share some very quick thoughts about that, but I think we're already really in the thick of this. What this is it's creative and it's open and it's thoughtful, and this is filled with a wide range of stakeholders. And we're focused on the possibilities. We're not focused on necessarily the why this can't happen, the why nots. We're focused on the why shouldn't it. And we want to be the catalyst for change. But to give ideas of what we're not, and I think we're already headed there, is we're not, oh, you want to be test optional or maybe test flexible. No. This isn't a typical conference. There aren't going to be panels of people speaking at you despite kind of this conversation now. Hack the Gates is not a place to protect institutions or athletic conferences or sacred cows. That's not the place. This is not what we're going to do. Steve Frappier, I think, has one of the best ideas I've heard of any conference ever, where his idea is that, like having a swear jar, whenever someone's involved in a conversation about Hack the Gates, anytime that you mention your institution or your job title, you have to make a donation to something. That's not what's important. We also hope that you find that kind of freeing. In terms of our expectations for folks who want to play in the sandbox with us, we want you to adopt the improv comedy mantra of yes and by that, we want you to be open to new paths. I think one of the things in these conversations where people whenever I've tried to have these conversations in the past, one of the things that I found is folks will say, yeah, but this won't work, and here's why this won't work, and this won't work, and oh, and then we get caught there. Well, we're not going to do that this time. We're just going to say yes and.
What was it, Elizabeth? Not an endorsement, but Elizabeth Warren during one of the debates turned to one of the other candidates and said, you know, I don't know why anyone would go through all the trouble of running for president if all you're going to talk about is things that won't work. So,
exactly. Yeah. And again, we want you to stretch yourself and to think big and encourage other people to do so and to pose those really big, hard questions. But along the lines of those big, hard questions, let's get back to those because there's some great ones coming. Which one do you want to tackle next, OiYan?
Stephanie says, transformative change comes at the cost of pulling people out of their comfort zone of the status quo. I think higher ed has previously seen different efforts that the people making those efforts thought were transformative. And the efforts have been met with a lot of negativity and resistance to change, kind of what we just talked about, from a variety of types of practitioners. How do you think we get people on board with whatever transformational movements come from this project?
Great question. For me, just my immediate reaction to that is you start now. You start by building community now. And I think that's one of the purposes of this, that transformational change so often, especially in higher ed, comes from on high, or as Heath pointed out, his new favorite band name, from the zit on Zeus's forehead. Big changes happen, movements happen, but buy-in from a wide range of voices, including leadership, but a wide range of voices, to me, is the critical way to make those changes happen eventually. But
can't spring it on someone 2 weeks before, right? You get them involved from the ground up. But OiYan, what do you think?
I mean, so yeah, I mean, movements take time, movements take community and really hard conversations. So I think that actually leads into Tara's fantastic question. Tara says, today, as I proclaimed in response to my frustration with the archaic college admission application and selection process, when is this old way of doing college admission, when this gets scrapped and we start fresh, things will be way different. And my colleague then asked me, who's going to pay you to do that? So who's paying, Marie?
What a great question. We're thinking about things. And part of thinking about it is thinking about how these things, get paid for. And I think about, I can't remember, I think it's AOC who says when people ask, well, who's going to pay for this policy change? Well, you ask about who's going to pay for the war. Who's going to pay for this? I don't know. We've got all these users, we have all these stakeholders, and we have in our company and in our profession some of the very, very wealthiest nonprofit institutions in the world. Seems to me they have cash.
Lots of different ideas. I mean, I also take the question of who's paying as, I think, oh, hi puppy. What we know is a big part of enrollment management that goes unacknowledged publicly oftentimes is the ever-present Wu-Tang Clan philosophy of higher education, which is cash rules everything around me. Get the money, dollar bill, y'all. And so Cream is my nickname for my higher ed finance class when I teach it. And so when I see this question, who's paying, that's what I'm wondering, as well is if we know that enrollment management is also about meeting budgetary goals, right? How do we not let these institutional realities of finance and budget get in the way of what I think is a much more important mission, which is equity, right? And I definitely see a lot of these institutions balancing, and there's that age-old saying, no margin, no mission, which when a guest lecturer came to one of my classes at Loyola Chicago, my grad students cringed when he said that phrase, no margin, no mission. Talk about dehumanizing. So end capitalism? I don't know.
Right. Well, and it's funny because I've reread this question a couple of times, and my reaction was immediately like, well, who's going to spend the capital to develop these tools, right? But then as I've been looking at this question, I think I want to answer in a different way. And who's paying? I think we look already right now at who's paying for the current system. And who's paying for that would be every single person engaged with it. And we're paying for it either by really clunky systems that don't work, or systems that are rooted in racism or built to be inequitable. We all pay for this in one way or another. We know that enrollment, college admissions professionals, we pay with mental health and with sleep and with, life balance. Our students pay by the hoops that they have to jump through that have nothing to do with the reported purpose of this process. So who's paying, who's going to pay for this? Well, I think we should do a quick audit of who's paying now for the system, because it's all of us too.
Yeah, really great question and really great dialogue that can come from this. Catherine Box asks regarding who will be at the Hack the Gates table, and I presume that means the hackathon table. In regards to predictive modeling, what about the corporate arm of admissions and those who are driving the machine? Are there efforts to engage representatives from those entities to be part of the Hack the Gates project?
What a provocative and interesting question. I'm going to write this one down.
When you and I have talked about who's going to be at the table for the hackathon, and I've commented on this in Facebook and elsewhere, that for the hackathon, the people I want there are folks who are willing to be uncomfortable about what it means, that what some of the ideas that come out might mean for their profession, including predictive modeling, I think, and some of these consulting firms that do predictive modeling, perhaps. Or, yeah, like for folks to really be uncomfortable and say, like, you know, really deal with that tension between margin and mission, if mission is equity. So John Burdick again, are we going to be able to partner any parts of our reinvention discussions with others considering reform, such as turning the tide, character collaborative, CIS, master transition, even people within College Board pursuing the same problems with maybe a less radical inclination? I'm gonna let you handle that, Marie.
Oh, I'm typing an answer to a question right now. Also, I don't play with non-radicals. I mean, John, that's an excellent question. I think it's the point is there are lots of different voices who should be at the table. I do know that we've received, well, gosh, I want to say there are a bunch of motorcycles racing through my neighborhood. It's very, very strange. I live in a very residential place. Sorry. You know, we ask folks to nominate people to participate in the Hack the Gates convening in person. And we've received, I think, close to 150 nominations for that. And I know that there are folks who are engaged with Turning the Tide and Master Transcript and College Board. And there are lots of folks who are now engaged in that work who have been nominated. That's one of the things I love about this profession, right? Is you might work at a place, but we all try to be engaged with a lot of things. So I think those folks will absolutely be in there. I think to the point though that you made of pursuing the same problems with a less radical inclination. Like OiYan said, part of the being able to play in the sandbox is a willing to play.
Mm-hmm. If you can't dream it, you cannot really get very far, I think. I don't know.
What is that song from Rocky Horror about dreaming it and being it? Could someone please tell us that song from Rocky Horror? Thank you.
Okay, so it's 8 minutes till half past the hour, and so I want to get to our next step slide as we've gotten through a lot of our questions. And so the last day for hackathon nominations is tomorrow. So if there's anyone who feels inspired today and you definitely want to be in DC November 8th and 9th, it's also the tail end of the College Board Forum. So for those of you who are already going to be in town, perhaps just if you get an invitation, just extend your stay a couple days. I'll turn it over to Marie and I'll find the link and I will post it in the chat box as well as the Facebook group for last day of nominations. Marie.
So we're going to take nominations. We're going to try to get through that information and get it out the door as quickly as possible because we know some folks might need to take care of travel issues. For those of you attending the NACAC conference, the National Association of College Admission Counseling, if you're attending that conference next week, like 9 days from now, in Louisville, join us on Thursday, the 26th at 9:45 in the morning. And we're going to have a meetup and give you other updates about accept, but also really gathering information about Hack the Gates and gathering some of your ideas. We're going to have our second webinar. The second webinar is October 21st. Okay, so let me just acknowledge first. I know that no one who works in this profession has any time for any damn thing in October. At the same time, we know that we want this information out there. So think of these webinars as a nice break in your travel or writing or essay proofing, maybe. Sorry.
Fun
so
times.
The next webinar is OiYan is so good at coming up with names for things. The next webinar is called "Is Anyone Really Surprised by Aunt Becky? Problematizing Admissions and Institutional Priorities." And this is one where, so this one's been like she and I talking about practitioner and kind of the history of it. This one's going to be a different perspective. It's going to be these outstanding researchers who are doing some just bleeding edge work, talking about what they are seeing from their perspective and challenging us as the stakeholders to do something about this. It's going to be moderated by Davin Sweeney, who works with CollegeWise and is a fabulous interviewer for the podcast, The Crush, and he's fantastic.
Thank you, Davin. So excited to join you for that.
stay in touch with us via our website, hackthegates.org. Join the Facebook group, Hack the Gates. We're going to have more conversations there, and we're going to really engage with each other as much as possible. And whenever you use social media and talk about us, use the hashtag HackTheGates.
Yep. Thank you. So I think that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for our first Hack the Gates webinar. This was super fun.